Yes, we did it. We bought the most hated camera on the internet, the Canon EOS R. And that's our review. So, welcome to our channel. My name is Damien Cooper from Monkey Pixels. We do a lot of tech reviews and travel videos and all that kind of stuff. So consider subscribing if you like what you see, because we're posting at least once or twice a week. So we got to test this camera on 2 different continents for photography as well as videography in a really extreme setting where we're under high pressure. So I think we got a pretty good view on what this camera can and can't do, so let's start the review. Okay, before actually starting this review, let's say one thing. I'm not a Canon fanboy. I have been a Canon user pretty much all my life. I did actually switch to Sony one time, then came back to Canon for different reasons, and I really don't like how Canon keeps playing spec bingo with all their cameras. Let's insert this spec into this camera, but none of the others, and then let's just not put that feature in, and I don't know, it's just completely random to me what they're doing with the cameras, and I really don't like it. But anyway, let's start the review and see what you think. Mostly we're doing Instagram photography. We're really active on Instagram, so you can follow us here if you want to see what kind of pictures we already captured with the Canon EOS R and ongoing pictures we're going to capture. So basically this is 95% portrait photography. The rest might be a little bit of landscape here and there, some detailed shots, and when we're getting paid to actually do photography other than Instagram, it's going to be some portrait client work, which is either in the studio or outdoors as well. So basically pretty much just set up portrait work. We don't shoot weddings anymore, we hardly ever take pictures of any events, so like a really high-speed shutter or the whole drama about the dual card slots doesn't really matter to us too much. Yes, I had SD cards fail on me within the last 10 to 15 years of doing photography, but maybe once or twice, so I'm willing to take that risk if it's not a wedding. Again, if it's a wedding, I understand the big deal about having 2 card slots, but again, like we don't, so we wouldn't even use it as a redundant media source if we had 2 card slots anyway. So what do I really like about the photography side of this camera? Coming from the Canon 1DX Mark II, I like that it has more resolution that gives us a little bit more room to cropping in. Sometimes we have a really great Instagram picture that was shot in portrait mode, but we want to use it as a thumbnail, so that a little bit extra resolution gives us the option to actually make a 16:9 landscape mode out of a portrait shot, which is a cool option. The other thing I really love is that it's a mirrorless camera and that we have eye autofocus as well as face autofocus on this camera, as well through the EVF as well as the back screen. That makes framing just so much quicker and so much easier. It's basically just point the camera at your subject, move the camera around to get your framing, and the camera finds the face as well as the eye autofocus pretty much 99% of the time, which I really love. Especially when shooting on the 5D Mark IV, which we also tried for photography. It's kind of like annoying because you don't really have that many autofocus fields, so you need to move that cursor around every time, and then sometimes you even miss a shot. So with that, it's literally just point and shoot, which I really love. The flip out screen helps a lot with framing too, especially if you want to get these low angle shots. And yeah, of course, the DSLRs like the Canon 1DX Mark II has a live view mode as well, but I really don't like it. It's really laggy, and if I'm shooting on a DSLR, I'm using the optical viewfinder 99% of the time. So yes, of course, there's the weight and there's the size. I usually like a little bit of a bigger camera, so the Sonys were always a little bit on the smaller side, and that has pretty much the perfect size if you just want to carry it around. You can throw it in some kind of small bag, or you can even, have it hanging around your neck for the entire day, and it's really not putting too much stress on your neck when the 1DX gets really heavy after a while. Since we're already owning a Canon cinema camera, we're not using the native lenses for the Canon EOS R, and we're just using the EF lenses we already have. So our camera came with the adapter mount, and we have the one with the control wing. We're going to switch that out for the one with the ND filters later on, but for now this thing is really cool when it comes to photography, because you just set up your aperture as well as your shutter speed, and then you can quickly just dial in the exposure on the ISO with the control wing, which is a feature I really like. And if I was doing mostly photography, I would definitely keep that adapter ring because it's pretty much a game changer for me. So yes, it's definitely slower than our 1DX Mark II by 6 frames, I think, but we're not shooting sports as I've already mentioned, so it's not really a big deal for us. The autofocus has worked really great, and for our portrait Instagram as well as portrait client work, it's exactly the camera we were hoping for. Okay, that's pretty much everything about the photography part. Like I said, we're not full-time working photographers only, we're doing mostly video work, so this camera for our photography needs is really what we were hoping for. So let's get into the video part, because that's where we earn our money with. So what are we shooting with other than a Canon EOS R? I have to say that we do have a cinema camera. It's a Canon C200, which is our main camera for pretty much everything we do video-wise, but we also a lot of the times need a B cam, and up until this point it has been the Canon 1DX Mark II and occasionally the 5D Mark IV. And we're basically selling both of these cameras to switch to the Canon EOS R. So yes, I think the Canon EOS R is virtually better at everything than these two cameras when it comes to video, except for maybe the 120 frames that is just not existent on this camera. So let's start off with everything that everybody is raging about this camera. So the missing dual card slot really is no big deal for us, because our cinema camera only has one CFast card slot. Pretty much every RED camera only has one RED magazine. So the whole thing about only having one card slot really doesn't matter to us, because all our other cameras can't record redundant video anyway. The next thing is the 4K crop. Would I rather want to have a full frame 4K like other cameras? Definitely yes. Is it such a big deal? For us, it really isn't. Why? And let me explain that. Because our main camera, the C200, actually has a 1.5 sensor crop because it's a Super 35 sensor. So the 1.7 something crop of the 4K at the EOS R is much closer to our actually framing of the C200 than it would be if it was full frame. So we're using this as a B cam for interviews or such things. It's really not a big deal because the focal lengths are pretty much the same, or we can actually use that to our advantage because the C200 has a much bigger dynamic range, so we're usually using this for the wide angle shot and then setting up the Canon EOS R as a tight portrait shot, and the cropped in factor actually gives us a little bit more focal length without having to put on a 70-200, for example. And here's the other thing that I kind of like. This is my view on the whole crop factor. It's just so I'm using the Canon EOS R as my main source of video shooting. Most of our shoots are a mixture between 24 and 60 frames, or if you're in Europe, 25 and 50 frames. So because we're usually shooting some talking content or some regular motion content and have that layover with some B-roll in slow motion, 50 to 60 frames. So if I had 4K and no sensor crop, I wouldn't use the 4K anyway, because I wouldn't want to mix the 4K full sensor with the slow motion in 1080, because then you would drastically see the difference between the two of them. So if this camera doesn't have 4K 60, which pretty much no competitor in that price range has anyway, I think that is totally fine when it comes to not having full frame. And then people say, hey, the GH5 has 4K 60. Yeah, but it's nowhere near full frame and has an even bigger crop in 4K than the Canon EOS R has. So the whole crop in factor for us really isn't a big deal. If it had 4K 60 and both would completely be cropped, then yes, it would have been unfortunate and I'd rather want to see a full frame version of that. But since it doesn't, I wouldn't use the 4K for most of the stuff anyway. And if I'm just talking head filming myself on YouTube and I want to do that in 4K, which maybe you don't want to do anyway because it's a really large amount of memory space you're using up for just filming yourself on YouTube, then I don't know, yes, maybe just use a wider lens, and I don't think it's that big of a deal. So the next thing everybody's raging about is the missing 120 frames in full HD. And I'm 100% on board with that. Pretty much every other camera in that price range has it, and this camera just doesn't have it. And this is really unfortunate, and I don't really know why they didn't include it, and I will miss it since we're selling our Canon 1DX. We don't really have any 120 frames usable with autofocus anymore, which is also fine because in the end, we don't really use it that often. For most stuff, 50 to 60 frames is enough anyway, and I think the whole 100 and 120 frames is completely overused, especially on YouTube, where everybody's just slapping in B-roll with 100 or 120 frames and call it a day. I also think I heard some people complain about the battery life on the internet about this camera, and I don't really understand why. We were shooting pictures all day, shooting video, and we hardly had to switch batteries even once. So maybe there's a confusion because they used older batteries like the LP6 instead of the LP6N, I think it's called. So we're shooting with the newer batteries and we didn't have any problems whatsoever. So we just came back from Abu Dhabi where we had 100 hours to film a 100-second travel video for Etihad Airways. And we took the EOS R as our second camera, so that was really stressful. We started shooting in London and then we were in a really tight frame and running through the Abu Dhabi desert in sandstorms and during night, no sleep. So we really put that camera to test when it came to photography as well as video. So I think we got a good grasp on what this camera can and can't do. The video is already on our YouTube channel, so check it out before you actually watch this, because pretty much 50% of that video was shot on the Canon EOS R, and most of the times you can't even tell a difference if it was shot in 4K on our cinema camera or on the Canon EOS R. The link is going to pop up somewhere up here, so watch it first, then come back so you have a better understanding of what this camera actually can do. So like I mentioned earlier that we went to Abu Dhabi, what did we actually use the Canon EOS R for? So, since we had a really tight schedule, I mostly used the Canon C200 for everything handheld, run and gun. But when we needed a fast gimbal camera, the Canon EOS R was way easier to just put on the Xeon Crane 2, walk around with it and get these smooth, really motion shots that we needed. Another thing was that in some locations they didn't let us in with a big heavy cinema camera, so having a small mirrorless was really crucial and saved our asses more than once when we didn't get into the location with a big camera, but it was fine for them to film with a smaller camera. And all that footage actually made it into the final film, and it wouldn't have been possible with another camera other than the Canon EOS R, because there were other people that didn't let in with the Canon 1DX Mark II, for example, so the smaller size of the camera was actually needed. So one thing I really like about this camera too is the flip out screen. I'm not a vlogger, but again, like when I'm doing these low angle shots, I often just ended up filming completely into the dark because I couldn't see anything on the LCD screen. And now that you have a flip up screen, it just gives you way more angles to actually film when you're filming right, left, overhead, or these low angle shots. And here's the thing that I really miss about pretty much all the other cameras in the Canon lineup, and that is C-Log. Even our 1DX Mark II, which is pretty much the flagship, it shoots 4K 60, 4K 25, 4K 24, and it doesn't have C-Log. So it's really hard to get the dynamic range out of it. I didn't find the dynamic range on the Canon EOS R really that impressive, to be honest, but definitely better than on the 1DX Mark II. And here's the thing, it matches really nicely to our Canon C200. And it was so easy to match all these shots in post. We actually didn't even have the time to make custom LUTs for the Canon EOS R and only used the custom LUTs we made for our C200 to put onto the EOS R, and they pretty much matched perfectly. And if you're interested in it, the whole video and all our videos are graded with our custom LUTs, and you can find them on the store, and they're specifically made for different kind of cameras. So check them out if you want to, and the link's in the description below. So one other neat little feature that a lot of people overlook is the little door that shuts down whenever you detach the lens. So it actually saves your sensor from getting dirty. And shooting in the Abu Dhabi desert, where there were sandstorms everywhere, that actually is a really good thing that people undervalue a lot when shooting out on location. Because our C200, we had to scrap in there with a toothbrush, we had to, you know, clean the sensor afterwards, and the sensor was completely untouched of the Canon EOS R. So that is one neat little feature that other cameras don't have. And also a complete game changer for us is the option to get internal ND filters via the adapter ring later. And I can't think of any other camera in that price range that actually has the option for internal ND filters. And when you're running gunning, I don't really want to have this on front of the camera, especially for a gimbal camera. You don't want to have the variable ND filters on top of the lens, because you need to switch them. Whenever you go inside, you have to detach them, because you can't really, otherwise you have to really open up the ISO. So for us, having the option for internal ND filters is a game changer. So let's talk about time lapses, because this is what we use our B camera for a lot. So shooting on the A cam while setting up the B cam to shoot a time lapse is one thing we do a lot of the times. Unfortunately, for some reason, and here's the Canon spec bingo again, the Canon EOS R doesn't have an integrated intervalometer, so you can actually shoot raw pictures and then stitch them back together in post, which I was really upset about in the beginning. But it does have a 4K time-lapse mode where you can dial in your settings completely manual, and we ended up using that on the shoot in Abu Dhabi. And we also used that in London, and the time-lapses coming out of this camera are actually really good. I didn't really expect that, and I was definitely positively surprised by the quality that came out of the 4K footage. Yes, I would rather have the ability to grade them manually, but again, this is so much more time, and we couldn't have even done it on that job in Abu Dhabi, so we would have ended up using the 4K internal time lapses, and to be honest, they're fine for 98% of the work we do anyway. So there you have it. We tested this camera under extreme conditions, shooting pictures as well as a video in London as well as in Abu Dhabi, and honestly we couldn't be more satisfied with it. We got the shots we needed, we put out a gorgeous video that we are really proud about, considering we only had 100 hours to shoot, edit and grade the whole thing and deliver it to the client. And the Canon EOS R was actually a crucial part in it, and I don't think we could have gotten the same result with either a Canon 1DX Mark II or a Canon 5D Mark IV. So what do you think about the Canon EOS R? I mean, a lot of people are really disappointed, but I feel like a lot of people haven't really used that camera. If I had to choose to just buy one camera and that's it, and I didn't have any lenses or anything, maybe the Canon EOS R wouldn't be my first choice, and I probably would lean more towards a Canon A7 III, but in our setting where you already have a camera and you use it as a B camera or your main photography camera, I couldn't be more satisfied with the Canon EOS R as well. So I hope you liked that review, and let's start the comment section what this camera can do and why you hate on it, or if you actually like it or if you bought it, because I really want to know your opinion, especially after watching our video that we shot in Abu Dhabi, because that kind of displays that this camera can do a lot more than a lot of spec geeks out there tell this camera that it can't do. So I hope you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing, and I'll see you on the next one. Wait. So I even made notes on what to talk about, but how could I forget about the external 10-bit output of this camera? Because As far as I know, there's hardly any camera that can do that. And for us, as having the C200 as our main camera, shooting the B-roll when we're shooting in RAW in 10-bit as well to match the 4K RAW of this camera is one feature that hardly any of the other cameras have. So shooting in 10-bit externally on the Canon EOS R is one feature that I really like about it as well. And that's about it. All right, see you.